In May 1942, the global conflict had entered its third year, and the balance of power was still shifting. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, were advancing on multiple fronts, and the Allied forces, though reeling from significant losses, remained resolute. Britain, having withstood the Blitz in 1940 and 1941, was now in a fragile position. Its military forces were stretched thin, and its resources were running low. The hope for a decisive victory rested on a series of ambitious, albeit controversial, strategies. Chief among these was the belief that a strategic bombing campaign, targeting the heart of Germany's war industry and civilian morale, could turn the tide of the war. The mastermind behind this daring and deeply debated plan was Air Chief Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris. Harris was appointed the commander of the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command in 1942, at a time when Britain's bombing campaign against Germany was in its infancy. The theory of strategic bombing was nothing new, but it had yet to be fully realized on the scale that Harris envisioned. The idea was simple in principle. By bombing German cities and industrial centers with such ferocity and frequency, the Allies could cripple Germany's ability to produce war materials and break the spirit of the civilian population. Harris, a man of singular conviction, embraced this doctrine with an intensity that would define his legacy. He was not a man to hesitate in the face of controversy or dissent. To him, the primary objective was clear: destroy Germany's capacity for war by obliterating its cities, factories, and infrastructure, and in the process, create a psychological toll on the German civilian population that would eventually force the Nazi regime to surrender. Bomber Harris was known for his no-nonsense attitude and his unwavering belief in the power of air bombardment. Unlike many of his contemporaries who advocated for more targeted precision strikes, Harris believed that only a relentless and all-encompassing bombing campaign would achieve the desired results. In his mind, a precise surgical strike would not be enough to break the Nazi regime's grip on power. Instead, it would take a massive, indiscriminate aerial assault that would stretch the German war machine to its breaking point. At the time of Harris's appointment, Britain had already experienced several years of aerial bombardment by German Luftwaffe. The Blitz, which had devastated London and other British cities in 1940 and 1941, had demonstrated the destructive power of airstrikes, but it had also shown how resilient the British people were in the face of adversity. Harris, however, was determined not to play the victim. He saw the bombing of German cities not as an act of retaliation, but as a proactive measure to cripple Germany's war capabilities before it could cause more damage to the Allies. The scale of Harris's vision was immense. Under his leadership, Bomber Command launched a series of large-scale night raids against German cities. The goal was to overwhelm the Luftwaffe's defenses and disrupt German industry by targeting factories, rail yards, and other critical infrastructure. The raids would often take place under the cover of darkness, as Harris believed that night bombing would minimize casualties among British airmen and make it harder for the Germans to mount effective counterattacks. As the campaign progressed, however, the limitations of Harris's strategy became apparent. The raids, while increasingly successful in terms of the damage inflicted on German industry, were also costing the British dearly in terms of aircraft and aircrew losses. The technological limitations of the time meant that bombing accuracy was poor, and many of the raids targeted civilian areas, resulting in significant casualties among the German population. The destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals led to growing moral and ethical questions, both within Britain and internationally. Some critics, including members of the British government and military, questioned whether the strategy was achieving its intended goals or whether it was merely causing unnecessary suffering for civilians. Despite the growing controversy, Harris remained steadfast in his belief that strategic bombing was the key to victory. He argued that the damage inflicted on German industry and morale was essential for bringing the war to a close. In his mind, The destruction of cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin was not an act of vengeance, but a necessary step in defeating Nazi Germany. Harris's belief in the effectiveness of his strategy was unshaken, even as the moral implications of his tactics came under increasing scrutiny. By the summer of 1942, the campaign was beginning to pick up steam. Harris had laid the groundwork for what would become a sustained, multi-year aerial assault on the heart of the Third Reich. The RAF's bombers, including the iconic Avro Lancaster, began to carry out raids that would soon become infamous for their scale and devastation. The city of Cologne was one of the first major targets of the Bomber Command, and the raid in May 1942, which saw more than 1,000 British bombers attack the city, marked a new level of intensity in the war's aerial campaigns. It was the first of many such raids that would culminate in the destruction of German cities and the loss of thousands of civilian lives. Harris's belief in the strategy of strategic bombing was based on his conviction that the destruction of German industrial capacity would ultimately weaken the Nazi regime and force it to capitulate. While his approach was controversial and resulted in the deaths of countless civilians, it was also an effort to strike at the very heart of Germany's war-making ability, hoping that the Nazi leadership would ultimately be forced to surrender. In the coming years, the strategic bombing campaign would intensify, leading to raids on other major German cities, including Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin. The devastation wrought by these attacks would have a profound impact on the course of the war, forcing the Germans to divert resources away from the front lines to protect their cities and industrial centers. However, as the war dragged on, the ethical debate surrounding Harris's methods would continue to grow louder, with many questioning whether the cost in civilian lives was worth the eventual outcome. Bomber Harris's legacy remains a subject of intense debate to this day. Some view him as a hero who played a key role in defeating Nazi Germany, while others see him as a controversial figure who, despite achieving military success, caused immense suffering through his bombing raids. What is certain is that his unyielding belief in the power of air bombardment, combined with his bold leadership, played a pivotal role in shaping the outcome of World War II. His legacy is tied to both the successes and the moral dilemmas of strategic bombing, making him one of the most polarizing figures in the history of warfare. By 1942, Bomber Command was in a precarious situation. The early years of the war had been difficult for the Royal Air Force, as it struggled to impose its will on Nazi Germany through strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe, though initially weakened during the Battle of Britain, had regrouped and built formidable defenses. In response, Bomber Command had relied on night raids to avoid enemy interceptors and to exploit the limited effectiveness of Germany's radar systems. However, despite the RAF's best efforts, the results were far from satisfactory. The raids had often missed their targets, with bombers failing to hit critical infrastructure and industrial centers. In fact, many bombing missions had ended in little more than widespread destruction of civilian areas, as bombers lacked the precision to strike vital industrial sites effectively. German industrial output had remained remarkably resilient, and vital production centers for war materials like aircraft, munitions, and fuel continued to operate despite the constant bombardment. This lack of decisive results led to growing frustration within the British government and military, and the effectiveness of the bombing campaign was being increasingly questioned. To make matters worse, the British public had been bearing the brunt of the Nazi air assault for nearly 2 years. Blackouts, rationing, and constant threats from V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets created an atmosphere of despair. Morale was at a low point, with many questioning whether Britain could ever break the grip of the Axis powers. If the war was to be won, it was becoming clear that something drastic needed to be done. At the heart of this dire situation was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the newly appointed commander of Bomber Command. Harris, a man of intense conviction and unyielding belief in the power of air bombardment, was determined to turn the situation around, but for this to happen, he needed a victory, something that would not only prove Bomber Command's effectiveness, but also inspire hope in both the military and the British public. It was a challenge Harris was prepared to meet head-on, and his solution would be nothing short of audacious. Harris conceived a plan so bold that it had never been attempted before, to launch a single raid involving over 1,000 bombers targeting a major German city. The scale of this operation was staggering. No air force in history had ever conducted such an assault. The logistics of assembling such a large force were daunting, as Bomber Command, at the time, had only about 400 frontline aircraft at its disposal. Despite the shortfall in resources, Harris was undeterred. His approach was unconventional but practical. Rather than solely relying on Bomber Command's frontline aircraft, he made the decision to press every available resource into service. Harris instructed his staff to scour every training squadron, maintenance unit, and auxiliary formation to find any usable aircraft. Instructors, who were normally responsible for training new air crews, were reassigned to flying duties, and even crews that had received minimal training were brought into the fold. Aircraft that had been deemed outdated or were in poor condition were pulled from storage and reworked to ensure they could still perform in combat. Nothing was left to chance. Every available man and machine was called upon to contribute. The sheer scale of the effort was nothing short of a logistical miracle. Harris's strategy was not just about the raw firepower of the raid, it was also about sending a message. The raid would demonstrate that Britain could strike anywhere in Germany with overwhelming force, whenever it chose. It would show the Nazis that no city was beyond reach, that the British could hit the heart of the Reich whenever they desired. But this was not just about military strategy. It was also about morale. The raid had to be a success, not only in terms of causing damage to Germany, but also in restoring hope to the beleaguered British public and giving them a sign that the tide could indeed be turned. To achieve this, Harris knew the raid needed to be meticulously planned. The target had to be a major German city, one whose destruction would send a powerful message. But at the same time, it had to be a city whose industrial capacity would allow the bombers to strike at critical infrastructure. It was decided that Cologne, one of Germany's largest cities, would be the primary target. It had a significant industrial base and was home to several key rail yards, factories, and transportation hubs. The city also had the added benefit of being far enough away from the front lines that it would be difficult for the Luftwaffe to respond in force. The mission would require precise coordination. The bombers would take off in waves, flying in formation across the English Channel and deep into German airspace. To evade the Luftwaffe's night fighter defenses, the bombers would fly at night, relying on their large numbers and surprise to overwhelm the enemy. The raid's success would hinge on the ability to coordinate the movements of hundreds of aircraft, all flying in tight formations, across enemy territory. For many of the crews involved, it would be their first experience in a raid of such magnitude, and they would have to rely on their training, skill, and determination to complete the mission. On the night of the raid, the scale of the operation became apparent as wave after wave of bombers took to the skies. More than 1,000 aircraft, an unprecedented number, set out from their bases in southern England, heading towards Cologne. The raid itself would be one of the most intense bombing missions ever attempted. Harris's bold plan would be executed with precision, and despite the risks, the bombers would ultimately succeed in causing significant damage to the city, including a devastating firestorm that consumed large parts of Cologne. The raid was not without its cost. Despite the sheer number of bombers, losses were inevitable. The Luftwaffe, although caught off guard initially, mounted a ferocious defense, and many British airmen would not return. However, the raid was considered a success, and it demonstrated the scale and power of Bomber Command's capabilities. In the aftermath, Cologne was left in ruins, and the mission became a turning point in the war's aerial strategy. It not only boosted morale in Britain, but also forced the Germans to divert resources to defending their cities, marking a significant shift in the strategic balance. The raid on Cologne, while controversial and costly, proved that Britain could strike Germany's heart with overwhelming force. It was a demonstration of Harris's audacity and his belief that air power, when applied with scale and determination, could turn the tide of war. Despite the ethical debates surrounding the bombing campaign and the civilian casualties it caused, the raid became a symbol of British resolve and a significant moment in the air war against Nazi Germany. It was the beginning of a relentless bombing campaign that would continue throughout the war and ultimately play a crucial role in the defeat of in the weeks leading up to the planned raid. The British bombing campaign had begun to hit a critical juncture. Bomber Command's raids had been a part of a broad strategy aimed at crippling Nazi Germany's war economy. But these raids had often yielded disappointing results. The crews were battle-hardened, but the targets remained elusive, the enemy defenses formidable. As Bomber Command worked to refine its tactics, the pressure for a success grew ever more intense. The decision to launch a raid with over 1,000 bombers against a major German city had become Harris's bold attempt to change the course of the war, but the final choice of target was far from straightforward. The first choice for the raid had been Hamburg, one of Germany's largest ports and industrial centers. The city, located on the Elbe River, was a strategic linchpin for Germany's wartime industry. It was home to massive shipyards, refineries, and factories, many of which contributed directly to the Nazi war machine. In terms of both military and industrial value, Hamburg was a prime target for the kind of massive bombing offensive Harris envisioned. However, as the date for the raid approached, the weather forecast caused a significant shift in planning. The weather in Hamburg was predicted to be poor, with low cloud cover and heavy fog expected to hamper visibility for the bombers. This would make it nearly impossible for the aircraft to navigate accurately, and it could have led to disastrous results if the bombers missed their intended targets. Harris, ever pragmatic and focused on ensuring the success of the mission, knew that a bombing raid with 1,000 aircraft was too significant to risk on bad weather. The strategic necessity of the raid demanded a clear, open path for the bombers to hit their mark. In a decisive move, Harris switched the target to Cologne, a city located farther south but still within reach for Bomber Command's bombers. Cologne, an ancient city on the banks of the Rhine, was a key node in Germany's industrial infrastructure. While it may not have had the same iconic status as Hamburg in terms of industrial production, Cologne was situated in the heart of Germany's industrial heartland, making it an ideal target for Bomber Command's strategic objectives. The city was home to several important military production facilities, including factories producing vehicles, munitions, and military supplies. The bombing of Cologne could not only disrupt these vital industries, but also serve as a powerful symbol of Britain's resolve. Furthermore, Cologne was in proximity to Britain, significantly closer than Hamburg, allowing the bombers to operate at full capacity, even if they had to rely on older or less capable aircraft. But the decision to change the target wasn't the only adjustment that had to be made in the lead-up to the raid. The complexity of coordinating an attack involving more than 1,000 bombers posed an enormous challenge. Bomber Command's previous raids had relied on a more traditional approach, where bombers flew separately or in smaller formations. This made it easier to avoid enemy interception, but it also decreased the overall concentration of firepower on any given target. Harris and his staff understood that if they were going to make a statement with this raid, they needed to maximize the destructive power of their assault. This required a new approach to coordination. The answer to this challenge came with the development of the bomber stream. This concept was revolutionary at the time and based on careful intelligence about German radar and night fighter defenses. The idea behind the bomber stream was simple. Instead of spreading out bombers in a wide, thin formation, they would concentrate in a dense flow of aircraft flying along the same route at timed intervals. By doing so, they could flood the enemy's radar systems and night fighter interception points with such a high volume of targets that it would overwhelm the German defenses. This would give the Luftwaffe night fighters less time to respond to each individual aircraft, making interception less likely. The bomber stream would also allow Bomber Command to mass its attack on the target, increasing the likelihood of hitting vital points in the city with overwhelming force. It was a bold strategy that relied on the use of both numerical superiority and technological innovation, combining the weight of numbers with the element of surprise. While there were risks in such a tactic, namely the potential for the bombers to be spotted earlier due to their tight formation, the hope was that the sheer volume of bombers would make the raid far more effective than any prior bombing missions. In addition to the bomber stream, Bomber Command also made use of the newly developed G navigation system. G was a radio-based navigation aid that allowed bombers to pinpoint their location more accurately, even in the dark of night. It was a significant leap forward from the rudimentary navigation methods used by earlier crews who had relied on dead reckoning and visual cues. G allowed the bombers to get closer to their target with greater precision, making the raids more effective in terms of damage and target destruction. While not perfect, the system dramatically improved the accuracy of the bombers, especially when combined with the dense bomber stream and the strategic decision to target key industrial sites. As the night of the raid approached, the scale of the operation became clear. More than 1,000 bombers would take off from their bases in southern England and head for Cologne. The raid was planned with military precision, but the challenges were immense. The bombers would have to navigate across enemy territory, avoid the Luftwaffe's defenses, and strike the city in a coordinated attack. As they flew towards their target, the crews would face not only the risk of enemy fighters, but also the possibility of flak from anti-aircraft guns and the threat of German radar systems tracking their movements. Even with the new tactics and technology, the bombers were still vulnerable. But the raid would not only test the resilience of Bomber Command's pilots, it would also test the effectiveness of their new strategy. Would the bomber stream succeed in overwhelming German defenses? Would the crews be able to execute the raid with the required precision? These were the questions that loomed over the mission. But Harris, despite all the uncertainties, knew that this was the moment to demonstrate Britain's strength, resolve, and ability to strike at the heart of the enemy. The operation was codenamed Millennium, and it would live up to its name. On the night of May 30th, 1942, as darkness enveloped Britain, over 1,000 aircraft began to lift into the sky. In all, 1,047 bombers took part, 602 Wellingtons, 131 Halifaxes, 88 Stirlings, 73 Lancasters, and others. Some of the aircraft were so old or experimental that they had never seen combat. The crews came from across the Commonwealth: British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealander, South African, and others. Many were barely out of training school. At 10:50 p.m., the first aircraft took off. One by one, the runways of southern England roared with engines as squadrons assembled in the night sky. The navigation was a ballet of precision. Each wave assigned its altitude, timing, and route. The bomber stream stretched for miles, a moving mass of metal and firepower. Cologne, meanwhile, was unaware of what was about to hit it. The city's defenses were not prepared for the scale of the attack. Flak batteries and night fighters had faced British bombers before, but never in this number, and never with such concentrated fury. At 12:47 a.m., the first bombs began to fall. The initial wave carried incendiaries designed to light up the target area for following squadrons. Fires began to rage across the city. Moments later, the high explosives rained down. Warehouses exploded. Rail yards disintegrated. Residential districts vanished in flashes of flame. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The cathedral, remarkably, remained standing, a towering silhouette against a sea of fire. The bombing continued for 90 relentless minutes. 1,455 tons of bombs were dropped in total, over 400 tons of high explosives, and more than 1,000 tons of incendiaries. The RAF's tactics worked. German night fighters intercepted only a fraction of the bombers. The bomber stream was dense and fast-moving, difficult to track and deadly effective. Cologne was devastated. Over 3,300 buildings were destroyed or damaged. Factories, homes, churches, nothing was spared. Fires engulfed entire blocks. The civilian population suffered terribly. 469 people killed, over 5,000 wounded, and more than 45,000 left homeless. Yet in the twisted logic of total war, the operation was hailed as a success. Compared to the scale of the raid, the RAF's losses were astonishingly low. 41 aircraft failed to return, less than 4% of the force. In Britain, the response was electric. The press roared with triumph. The BBC reported that the city of Cologne has been put out of action. Churchill personally congratulated Harris and sent messages of praise to the crews. For the first time, the Allies had shown that they could take the war to the heart of Germany with unprecedented force. In Germany, the reaction was equally intense, but far more grim. Hitler was furious. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was humiliated. Nazi propaganda tried to downplay the damage, but the facts were clear. Cologne was burning. The myth of German invulnerability was shattered. Operation Millennium also had an impact far beyond military circles. In the ghettos of Poland, whispers of the raid gave hope to the oppressed. In France, resistance networks rejoiced. The message was clear. Britain was not just surviving, it was fighting back. But the raid also sparked debate. Some questioned the ethics of bombing civilian cities. Others pointed out that Cologne's industrial output resumed within weeks. Harris himself acknowledged that a single raid could not cripple Germany. Yet he believed and convinced his superiors that sustained area bombing could grind the German war machine into submission. In the months and years that followed, Bomber Command would escalate its campaign. Raids on Hamburg, Berlin, and Dresden would dwarf even Millennium in scale and controversy. The doctrine of strategic bombing would remain central to Allied efforts and to post-war debate. Technologically, the raid marked a turning point. The bomber stream tactic proved revolutionary. Radar countermeasures began to be developed in earnest. Pathfinders, elite squadrons tasked with marking targets for the main force, became standard. Navigation aids were refined. The RAF was becoming not just larger, but smarter. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of Operation Millennium was psychological. It proved to friend and foe alike that Britain could muster enormous force. It showed that air power could project terror, disruption, and destruction on an industrial scale. And it set the tone for a new phase of war, one fought not just on battlefields, but in the skies over cities. As the sun rose on May 31, 1942, Cologne smoldered. Its people dug through rubble. Survivors emerged from shelters dazed and hollow-eyed. For many, it was a nightmare without warning. For others, it was the beginning of something darker, the realization that the war would not spare the home front. In England, meanwhile, exhausted crews returned to their airfields. Some had flown through flak and fire. Others had watched comrades vanish in explosions. But most made it home. They had done what no air force had done before. They had launched the largest bombing raid in history, and survived. And so, in the cold light of morning, Operation Millennium entered the annals of military legend. It was, and remains, a singular feat of organization, courage, and destructive power. It was not the end of the war, nor the final answer to Nazi tyranny, but it was a statement, loud, clear, and unforgettable. 1,000 bombers had flown in the night, and Cologne had burned.